lest we forget. Monday, November 11th, 1918, was a cool and rainy day in the forest of Campagny, just north of Paris. At 5:12 a.m. that day, Allied Supreme Commander Marshal Ferdinand Foch signed the armistice agreement that ended World War I. It officially came to effect at 11 a.m. Paris Standard Time. After 4 years of rain, mud, bullets, mustard gas, and rats, the First World War came to an end. As if by magic, the following weeks brought a high-pressure system across Europe that bathed the continent with sunshine and warmth. 100 years ago today, at the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, the war to end all wars came to an end. That phrase, the war to end all wars, was used to ensure that humans and future generations would not make the same mistake. There are no winners when it comes to war. Unfortunately, we have not fully learned the lessons of war. Today, on November 11th, 2018, from Syria to Kashmir, wars rage on over 60 battlefields on every corner of our planet. Brentwood's history has been touched by war. Later in this service, the Brentwood Roll of Honor will be read out by Lulu, Maria, and Jacob. One name you'll hear is from the famous 1940-41 First 15 rugby squad, whose remarkable season that year ended with a points total for 248 and only giving up 23 points against. His name is Ian Gillespie. A teammate of Ian, Colin Lytton Graham, immortalized his friend with this poem, A Distant Time. It can be found on the Gillespie Rock near the Foot Center. Most of that squad and other people from that generation volunteered to serve in the Second World War. It is my great honor to share it with you today. In the changing room after the Navy game, he said, "Indian, I've joined the Air Force." Through the steam from the showers, he was already a ghost. "Live forever, pussycat," I said. "I promised you, you'll live forever." We're all immortal when we go to war. You were posted missing in action the next I knew. Your Beaufighter went down over bomber escort over the Channel. At Runnymede, I saw your name 20 years later. It seemed a terrible waste of the best fullback the world had ever seen. The citation said you died drawing enemy fire. What else? You called for the mark, solid as houses. You tackled like a rattlesnake. You didn't leave the kitchen when the fire got hot. I promised you you'd live forever. Well, almost. While I live, so do you. On every square meter of this campus are ghosts of old Brentonians, calling you to be your best, to strive, to lead, and to serve. As we live, so do they, lest we forget. Please be upstanding for the singing of the Canadian National Anthem.
Please join me in the singing of the national anthem.
Come Today is the day when we remember those who gave their lives in the service of their country in wartime, in an attempt to ensure a better life for those who followed, namely us. War is a terrible way to have to address problems, and it can affect the entire populations of the countries involved. I was just 3 years old when World War II started. We lived in a lovely house in southern England, about 40 miles south of London, but I can remember that day with crystal clarity. There were no televisions in those days, nor did we have a radio in our home. My parents, my baby brother, and I gathered at my grandparents' house to listen on their radio to the declaration of war given by the Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain. The following weekend, I was with my father in our garden, trying to help him with the weeding, when the mailman came and delivered a buff-colored envelope. My father opened it right away, and I still remember seeing his face drop. It was his call-up papers for the British Royal Air Force. He left within a few days. He was just 29 years old. In the years that followed, I was to experience firsthand what it was like to live in a country at war. The small town in which we lived was about the size of Duncan, and there were 3 fighter plane bases within a few miles, so there was a great deal of noisy aerial activity. Very shortly after the start of the war, blackout conditions were imposed on all households after dark, because enemy bombers would otherwise see the lights and target them. Every night, these bombers came over us on their way to attack London, and the air raid siren would warn us of their approach. Air raid shelters were available, but not close to my home, so we huddled in total darkness under the stairs until the all-clear siren sounded. It was terrifying for a small boy of my age, and I have retained an absolute fear of the dark to this day. Shortly after the start of the war, I learned what war could do to individual families. My favorite uncle, my mother's younger brother, died when the Royal Navy submarine on which he was serving was torpedoed and sank during a battle in the Atlantic. He was just 19 years old, and I cried for days afterwards. Soon I was 5, and it was time for me to go to school. My mother took me on the first day, but after that I had to walk on my own. The school was about a mile from our house, and I remember many times diving under the nearest hedge when fighter planes from both sides were involved in conflict right overhead. The planes would swoop within a few feet of the ground in an attempt to escape an enemy plane. If there was an air raid during the daytime when I was at school, we had to rush to the shelter at the back of the school grounds and wait for it to end. This could be several hours. The shelter was nothing more than an underground concrete bunker, cold, damp, and devoid of lights or toilets. It was very smelly and primitive. When the enemy bombers attempted a daytime raid, they rarely made it as far as London before the RAF fighters engaged them. When this happened, they would often release their load of bombs in order to lighten up and get away faster. Tragedy often resulted. A small town a few miles from my home got the full blast of one of these mass bomb releases. Horribly, the primary school and all its students and staff were wiped out that day. During those years, and for several years after, food was rationed. Every family had a ration book for each member, with coupons that were removed by the food store when a purchase was made. Food could not be obtained without them. The allowed amount of food was very small. Fortunately, we had a very large garden and were able to grow some vegetables and fruit to supplement our rations. Imported foods were not available in the stores. They went towards feeding the armed forces personnel. I was 10 years old before I tasted an orange or a banana. I was 11 before I enjoyed my first ice cream. A few miles outside my home, there was a Canadian Army base, and I had my first introduction to Canadian generosity. We saw the soldiers in town quite often, and they were always so pleasant and friendly. Every Christmas, they sent a fleet of troop-carrying vehicles into town to pick up all the school-aged children. They took us to the army base and fed us a gigantic turkey dinner. They were not subject to rationing, and the food all came direct from Canada. It was so very good. I am sure that those Christmases did much to influence my decision to move to Canada in later life. As the war progressed, so did technology. Towards the end of the war, the enemy decided to try out some pilotless flying bombs. These were rocket-powered and were given just the right amount of fuel to get them to London, at which point the engines cut and the massive bomb dropped on the city. We called these things doodlebugs. Sometimes the amount of fuel was not quite right and the engine would stop early. They were extremely loud and we could hear them coming when they were miles away. We held our breath as they went overhead that the noise would keep coming. If it cut, we were in trouble. Fortunately, we escaped the many miscalculations that actually occurred. At this time also, the Allies had perfected their own new weapon, the atomic bomb. It took only 2 of these to bring about a peace treaty. Both fell on Japan, on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The destruction they caused was massive. During all those years, I saw my father only twice when he was given limited leave. For the rest of the time, he was stationed mostly in Holland. When the war finally ended, he was demobilized, and I was there at the train station to meet him when he came home. It was a wonderful day, but my memories of those previous years never left me. Several of my friends no longer had a father to meet. Today, let us remember those on both sides who gave their lives in that war and in all wars, ever trying to ensure that the human race would never again have to face such horrors. They shall grow not old, as we that are left grow old. Age shall not weary them, nor the years condemn. At the going down of the sun, and in the morning, we will remember them.
The War That Will End War. This was the title of a collection of articles written by H.G. Wells in the summer of 1914. Quickly, this unintentionally ironic catchphrase caught on as the first global war between empires waged. Initially, most Canadians who fought had volunteered because they optimistically believed the war would be over by Christmas. But casualties amassed, and the war effort required more boots in trenches. Muddy, flooded trenches which were poorly constructed, filled with rats, excrement, and sometimes the unburied. Trenches that left men with rotting flesh on their feet and amputated limbs. While Canada automatically joined the war as part of the British Commonwealth, Canadians soon argued the difference between choosing to fight and being made to fight. Notions of sacrifice, courage, loyalty, manhood were questioned as Canada dove deeper into the war effort. You are no exception. It's a crime to vote no. The women of Britain say go. There's room for you, said the recruiting posters, trying to coerce enlistment. By 1917, the issue of conscription became a national dispute, nearly shattering the country's unity. Like an invitation you can't refuse, other French and British colonies such as New Zealand, Algeria, and India were voluntold and sent hundreds of thousands of men to face active combat. What had started as a conflict between European powers for control of territory and people ended in global economic turmoil, displaced people, genocide, post-traumatic stress. Historians argue that the Spanish flu, which infected approximately 500 million people, 1/3 of the world's population, was also perpetuated by the war. First documented in the United States, it was called the Spanish flu because neutral Spain freely reported the pandemic without worry of lowering soldier morale, while other combating nations did not. By the time the Paris Peace Conference occurred in 1919, British Prime Minister David Lloyd George and later famous reporter Walter Lippmann used Wells's words almost sarcastically, for as we know, every war with delusion seeks to end war. World War I was characterized by battles of attrition, vintage tactics for gaining territory like scorched earth and bite and hold, were overshadowed by new technology, leaving forces stuck in stalemates, making a long and drawn-out war with fatality rates never experienced before. Being on the brink of modern warfare, the use of tanks, fighter pilots, and U-boats completely changed the concepts of warfare. Imperial military leaders failed to evolve their archaic tactics. Forces would fight for years in a back-and-forth fashion with heavy artillery only to capture yards, not miles. To illustrate just how brutal was the war, it is estimated that just as many people died during the 5-month Battle of the Somme as during the 19 years of the Vietnam War. Weapons of mass destruction were developed and chemical warfare was employed. During the Second Battle of Ypres in Belgium in 1915, poison gas, even though outlawed, was used en masse for the first time on the Western Front. Ypres was an essential location for the Allied forces for its rail and roadway access to ports, and where John McCrae wrote his preeminent poem. It is also where the Canadian Expeditionary Force, the first colonial force ever to hold steadfast against a European power, held their ground against the Germans until reinforcements could arrive. But, being a war of attrition, with a loss of almost 60,000 Allied soldiers within a month, victory is tough to measure. In northern France, Vimy Ridge is a location considered so revered that even Hitler commanded his forces to avoid maiming the monument in World War II. If you look on a $20 bill, you'll see the beautiful monument commemorating the First World War. There also stands the statue Mother Canada, mourning not only the loss of her children, but also all of those killed in the war. This iconic battle was fought and won by Canada. Thanks to new commanders and adaptive tactics, almost like underdogs, Canadian military leaders showed the world who Canada was, later earning a seat at the League of Nations. To this day, the land gifted to Canada by France is pocked with craters up to 4 meters wide and 3 meters deep from artillery fire. The land still hides close to 500,000 unexploded munitions. Back in Belgium, about 6 months after the Battle of Vimy Ridge, Canadian soldiers faced grueling mud and unrelenting rain to secure an advantageous piece of land, a ridge overlooking Ypres at the Battle of Passchendaele. Considered the most futile and controversial battle of the war, Passchendaele saw Canadian Lieutenant General Arthur Currie unwillingly lead troops into flooded, barren fields to relieve Allied forces, proving once again that old tactics known to military leaders before the war were ineffectual. What took the British Expeditionary Force 3 months of attempting, Lieutenant General Currie and the Canadians secured the targeted area in just 1 day. Capturing that piece of land, only about the size of 4 football fields, cost Canada nearly 16,000 in injured and killed soldiers. Sadly, Allied forces abandoned the stronghold 1 year later. With a small population of about 8 million people and less than 50 years old, the young nation of Canada was consumed by war between 1914 and 1918. In this war of attrition, Canada saw 650,000 men and women serve, and an astounding 73 Canadians, like flying ace Billy Bishop, received the Victoria Cross, the highest distinction in the British Commonwealth for valor. The last Canadian World War I veteran passed away in February of 2010 at the age of 109. His name was John Babcock, and at the age of 15, he lied about his age so he could serve. When his real age was revealed, he was sent to the Young Soldiers Battalion with 600 other boys who desperately wanted to serve but were too young. Instead, they were trained in England until they reached the age of majority and could go off to the front. As we gather today to observe the 100th anniversary of the armistice and reflect on the call to peace, I want to believe that the service of those who fought have not been in vain. I hope that my children and all of you will never feel compelled to take up arms, and one day Wells's words won't seem so naive.
Today, on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, people gather at war memorials to stand with their heads bowed. In 2 minutes of silence, we will pay tribute to the millions who were killed in war this past century.
Each will remember in his or her own way. Perhaps veterans will think of comrades as they were just a few seconds before death. Wives will remember the endless vigil for husbands who never returned. Parents will think of their children who were so young and alive when they left home for the last time. We, who today are so young and alive, will contemplate the horror of war and cherish the blessing of peace.
In the cemeteries of Europe, a simple maple leaf inscribed on over 100,000 gravestones tells passers-by that Canadians killed in battle lie buried there. An awful price in human lives was paid by the youth of past generations to achieve peace. By the act of remembering today, we ensure that their sacrifices are not forgotten.
Some who died came from Brentwood. In the old Brentwood chapel, built by the past generation of Brentonians, etched in oak on the memorial are the names of Brentwood fallen. Let us pay homage to the courage of those Brentonians who sacrificed their lives for their country. Please stand for the reading of the Roll of Honor, the last post, the silence, and the reveille. Here are old Brentonians of the old boys of Brentwood College who lost their lives during the war of 1939 to 1945.
Alec Belache, Docker Barrett Leonard, Norman Beard,
John Bishop, John Bryden, John Campbell,
Arthur Coulter, Alan Dunlop, Robert Field,
Ian Gillespie, John Gillespie, Bruce Hanbury,
Barnett Harvey, Sholto Marlett, Alan Mayhew,
Ken Osler, Richard Proctor, Robert Proctor,
Lee Salter, Ralph Smith, John Stubbs,
Donald Stewart, Glenn Svensson, Michael Simmons,
Thornton White, Lawrence Wilkinson, Ted Williams,
Remembrance Day is not a glorification of war. It is a call for peace. It asks each one of us, what have we done to make peace? Remembrance Day is the time for each one of us to think about what we are contributing to the future. Remembrance Day calls out that there should be no more names chiseled in gravestones of war anywhere in the world. The torch is being passed on, de manum in manum, from hand to hand, to you, the next generation. Let us all take a few minutes today to look into our hearts and to dream the dream of peace. In the lobby is the roll of honor of the Brentonian fallen. It was housed in the old chapel built by past generations of Brentonians. When you leave in silence at the end of the service, please leave your poppy at the roll of honor or come back to place it later. Please remain seated at the end of the service until an usher invites your row to leave.
what you saw across the bridge too far? Did it leave a scar? Or how you navigated wings of fire and steel, up where heaven had no more secrets to conceal. And still you found the ground beneath your wheels. How did it feel? Bang the drum slowly, play the pipe lowly, to dust be returning, from dust we begin. Bang the drum slowly, I speak of things holy above and below me, world without end. I meant to ask you, how when everything seemed lost, your fate was in a game of dice they tossed. There was still that line that you'd never cross at any cost. Meant to ask you how you lived what you believe, with nothing but your heart up your sleeve. And if you ever really were deceived by the likes of me, bang the drum slowly, play the pipe lowly, to dust me returning, from dust we begin. Bang the drum slowly, I speak of things holy above and below me, world without end. Gone now is the dead, gone the sun. There is peace tonight all over Arlington. But the song of my life will still be sung by the light of the moon you hung. I meant to